The Jack Allen family moved into their new Batavia home at 345 Union Avenue in 1958. After World War II, in most of America's major metropolitan areas, there was a shortage of homes for the returning veterans and most homebuyers. Batavia historians recall days when black families lived on the west side of Batavia alongside white neighbors. But then in towns like Batavia, realtors and banks limited the availability of homes in the more desirable neighborhoods. People of color were turned away. The shift occurred slowly, almost imperceptibly, and then blacks could only buy on the east side of Batavia. Nancy Allen was the mother of 6 sons. She managed a big house. Her recent stroke limited her mobility. She needed help. Over the years, several black women provided care and assistance. It is likely that their opportunities for housing in the Fox Valley Tri-Cities were limited due in large part to their race. There was a privilege gap between whites and blacks that gained attention in the 1960s. As a realtor with conscience, Jack Allen witnessed the housing discrimination firsthand. He took to heart the emerging messages of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for civil rights and justice reform. Jack began to advocate publicly for open or fair housing. His grassroots efforts focused on the Tri-Cities, where, after years of patient organization and persuasion, they eventually had an impact on local real estate dynamics. Along the way, as this obituary recorded, he took risks that put the future of A.L. Allen and Sons on the line. Starting in the mid-1960s, during the height of Dr. King's nonviolent protests across the South, Jack Allen wrote weekly letters to his family. Those letters and other archives preserve a period in the Tri-Cities' struggles with equal rights. It's a compelling story that deserves to be remembered in part because the need for social justice continues to this day. The first public evidence of Jack's civil rights initiative occurred in the spring of 1964. Despite his deep convictions, he had misgivings. Last week, I went to a meeting in St. Charles with some people to set up a human rights commission to initiate controlled integration. This week, I expect to get the board's statement of policy printed in the newspaper. This noon, I'm taking the 3 Episcopal priests of the Tri-City to lunch at Dunham Woods. I hope I don't get my head chopped off. In the Tri-Cities, Batavia, Geneva, and St. Charles created human relations councils, which objected to the Illinois Association of Real Estate Boards' statewide petition. In my opinion, that petition is insinuating, misleading, and inflammatory. I'm rather proud of the policy that our Batavia Real Estate Board did adopt. A broad conservative movement from the social right was mounting across the U.S., claiming that the proposed fair housing codes were forcing homeowners to sell their homes to people they didn't want to. This was a distortion of the truth, but Illinois conservatives were jumping on that populist bandwagon, and it was making Jack's job harder. In 1964, numerous peaceful demonstrations were organized by civil rights leaders across the South. They were often met with political resistance and police brutality. The murder of activists in Mississippi and the attack by white state troopers on peaceful marchers in Selma, Alabama, gained national attention. At a civil rights rally in Chicago's Soldier Field, Dr. Martin Luther King addressed a crowd estimated at 70,000 people. King told the rally that congressional support of civil rights legislation heralded the dawn of a new hope for the Negro. On July 2, 1964, Congress did pass the Civil Rights Act, whereby segregation on the grounds of race, religion, or national origin was banned. No longer could black people and other minorities be denied service simply based on the color of their skin. At least, that's the way the law was written. The Civil Rights Act and King's efforts in Chicago had ripple effects in the Fox Valley. More people were turning out for rallies. Last week, I went with Nancy to a meeting in Aurora at which there were about 500 people. After a speech by a terrific Negro preacher, we broke up into 12 discussion groups. A.L. Allen and Sons was not unified in its support of fair housing. In those days, it was natural that real estate firms would be reluctant to take political stands that might alienate buyers and sellers. Jack wrote to his brother Tom, "I'm having as much difficulty with Dad and Doug as I am with the other realtors because of their fear of public boycott of our office. I want to go ahead and show and sell where sellers and neighborhoods approve. But I am not allowed to do this. Time is working for tolerance, however, and I believe eventually it will work out. I hope I don't get caught in a buzzsaw." Jack was in the thick of crafting policy statements that would meet with sufficient approval. A local Negro came into our office to ask what our policy was. So yesterday afternoon, Dad, Doug, and I spent an hour talking with him and the chairman of the Human Relations Committee trying to work out a program. The precision in the thinking, writing, and speaking required is very taxing. Yesterday, I had my big scene with the full real estate board at the Baker Hotel. I got 3 votes, including my own, for this statement of policy as against 16. That's something. It seems to me we should first talk about what is the right thing, and then about what we're going to do to avoid the pitfalls, instead of the other way around, concentrating on fear. Lord, I hope you boys will stand up to what you think is right when you're put on the spot. That's what I'm trying to do. The year 1964 was a long year for laying groundwork, but fair housing was rising in the minds of the entire region. While Jack Allen built alliances throughout the Tri-Cities, Nancy Allen was organizing the Batavia League of Women Voters, gathering research, generating articles in the local papers that educated voters. Under the American Constitution, legislation has been the traditional tool for the creation of an open society, the means whereby members of minority groups are assured full participation in the benefits of our democratic government. One of the arguments in favor of legislation is that it places the burden of responsibilities on all citizens equally. Thus, if each citizen accepts under law his share of this responsibility, no one community, realtor, nor banker will be penalized. In Chicago, Illinois, the Chicago Freedom Movement was launched in earnest when local civil rights leaders again invited Dr. King to lead demonstrations against segregation in education and housing, as well as employment discrimination. Organizers pointed to Chicago's history as one of the most racially segregated cities in the nation. The combination of Dr. King's nonviolent protests, the public revulsion to the police response, and President Lyndon Johnson's political skills in Washington stimulated Congress to pass the Voting Rights Bill on August 5, 1965. During the fall, winter, and spring of 1965-66, the Chicago region took stock of the challenges it faced and developed its strategies within each municipality. I moderated a meeting yesterday in Chicago for the Episcopalian realtors. There were about a dozen there, also the bishop and two of his assistants. Sometimes it gets pretty discouraging in that most of the realtors are scared to death and rationalize their fear and justification. Despite efforts to maintain peace and harmony, in the summer of 1966, race riots erupted on Chicago's predominantly black West Side. On August 5, 1966, during a march in Marquette Park, an all-white Chicago neighborhood, to promote open housing, black and white demonstrators were met with intense, racially fueled hostility. Bottles and bricks were thrown at them. Dr. King, leader of the march, was struck by a rock. King admitted in a post-march interview that he had seen many anti-civil rights demonstrations in the South, but none that was as hostile and violent as the one he experienced in Marquette Park. In part, due to the Marquette Park riots and the public outcry, the Chicago Housing Authority promised to build public housing in predominantly white areas, and the Mortgage Bankers Association agreed to make mortgages available, regardless of race or neighborhood. After the agreement was announced, some Southern Christian Leadership Council staff stayed behind to assist with the housing programs and voter registration. Dr. King himself stayed in Chicago until January 1967. Meanwhile, back in the Fox Valley, the Federal Atomic Energy Commission was combing several U.S. locations for its huge new National Accelerator Laboratory, later named Fermilab. Property in the cornfields just west of Batavia, known as Weston, was one of the locations being hotly considered. Since many hundreds of highly educated employees would be transferred into the area for the laboratory, the government included among its criteria the availability of fair integrated housing. The area realtors wanted to sell homes to these scientists. However, Governor Otto Kerner wanted letters from area leaders affirming that there was no discrimination in the local housing market. The laboratory installed Kendall Williams as its head of public relations. Jack Allen's honest assessment about fair housing in the valley was circumspect. The problem now is that my dad is concerned that they won't come to Weston because of the open housing controversy. So far, our official decision has been to do nothing except tell the truth, but only if and when we're asked. I may have sold a lot to a Negro family in Brucewood. Haven't finally decided what, if anything, to do in preparing the neighbors in that community. Wish me luck. A week later, Jack wrote, "The purchase of the lot that the Negro family wants probably won't go through because the owner is apparently having second thoughts about selling to a Negro. This is one of only several occasions when the Negro family, who are very nice people, have been turned down, and they are becoming pretty discouraged." As 1967 arrived, affairs in the Tri-Cities and Chicagoland continued to heat up. On Thursday, I'm having lunch with Bishop Montgomery in Chicago. The subject of our conversation is what can the realtors in the diocese do about open housing, particularly when most of them oppose it for fear of property value or neighborhood depreciation, Negro takeover, economic reprisal, etc. Some of these Chicago realtors live on the near west side, where they fear actual physical violence. The white backlash runs so strong. It should be an interesting meeting. In March of 1967, the Chicago Sun-Times wrote a profile story about Batavian Reverend Truman Hazelwood, who was the Mid-County chairman of the NAACP. The article cited the racial inequities in the Tri-Cities. The Reverend Truman Hazelwood, a Negro, is building a home in an all-white neighborhood in Batavia. He said that he had searched for housing in the area, including in Aurora, for almost a year before obtaining the lot. He said that even with ordinances, it might be a while before Negroes in large numbers sought housing in the area because of past experiences. He said, people have a defeated attitude before they even start. I went over to a guy's house last night across from the Hazelwoods lot, and he wants to sell, but he's complaining about Hazelwood. I'm counting on the intelligence and fair-mindedness of the people of Batavia. I don't think I'm wrong about this, although I'll probably run into some unpleasant experiences, and these I anticipate. After spending a year living in Chicago working with area organizations to formalize fair housing, Dr. King had a sobering assessment. It appears that for all intents and purposes, the public agencies have reneged on the agreement and have, in fact, given credence to those who proclaim the housing agreement a sham and a batch of false promises. At a January 1968 meeting of Batavia's City Council, an estimated 150 people packed the chambers, while others stood in the foyer and down the stairs. Nonetheless, Mayor Art Swanson postponed the council's vote on the proposed fair housing ordinance until the February meeting. Reverend Hazelwood still presented a petition signed by 200 people in support of the ordinance, and Jack Allen also spoke to the crowd. It is my personal experience that the right of a Negro to buy a home where he chooses is being denied. This ordinance covers rights of both buyer and seller. If the right of a man to bring up his children where he wishes is denied, the right of property doesn't mean much. At the February council meeting, the aldermen first tried to amend the ordinance to exempt owners and protect against charges of discrimination, leaving realtors and banks with the liabilities. That version was defeated, but the council had to rewrite the ordinance once again in the subsequent months. Nancy and I were disappointed. We can say, though, that it was a terrific educational experience for everybody in the town. There were almost 100 people at the meeting. In a letter to Batavia's council aldermen, reprinted in the Batavia Herald, Nancy Allen offered this opinion to the core group who worked hard to write a fair ordinance. I attended the February City Council meeting when the open housing ordinance that you wrote and supported was emasculated by amendments that first legalized discrimination and then defeated it. My first reaction was to weep in sympathy for those who worked so hard for this fine ordinance. I was enraged and disappointed. Those of us who want justice for the Negro and want to see their property rights guaranteed must hold steadfast to our position. It will prevail with or without local ordinance, for it is just. Congratulations to you fine men and women for so ably studying and trying to solve a serious situation in our community. You did a fine job. Thank you. Nancy B. Allen. In early April of that year, Martin Luther King was shot dead in Memphis, Tennessee. News of King's assassination prompted major outbreaks of racial violence, resulting in more than 40 deaths nationwide and an extensive property damage in over 100 American cities. Following King's assassination, amid a wave of riots in more than 100 cities across the United States, President Lyndon Johnson increased pressure on Congress to pass additional civil rights legislation. The day after King's funeral, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the final legislative achievement of the civil rights era. The Act of 1968 was popularly known as the Fair Housing Act. A week ago, I took a trip to Denver to attend a civil rights convention. It was pretty exciting. I appeared on television with a Negro and the head of the Chicago office of the Leaders Coalition. Among the points I made were the problem of the urban crisis and housing, which can't be solved until the suburbs are involved, because that's where everything is going to happen in the way of moving industry. This involves the technical advice only a realtor can give. It was exciting and fun to be on television. Even though these events were confined to the 1960s, and no fewer than 3 major acts of Congress introduced civil, voting, and housing acts into American society, the messages of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. have yet to be fulfilled to this day. Many major metropolitan areas are still coming to terms with the generational disadvantages that people of color face. Redlining practices drove them into veritable ghettos where social, educational, and commercial services were scarce and substandard. Their disadvantages may take generations to reverse. Communities like those in the Tri-Cities will have to continue to work to enjoy the social diversity they once had a century ago. According to the 2020 census figures, in Batavia, blacks make up only 3% of the population. In their day, despite all of the adversity they faced, Jack and Nancy Allen remained optimistic that neighbors would find tolerance and fair-mindedness and come to respect each other's rights and privileges. Their grassroots efforts achieved a good deal to that end. Their example is an inspiration to us all.